So exactly what is so special about the traditional Latin Mass? Why would anyone prefer to attend Mass in a language that they don't even speak? So my experience with the traditional Latin Mass started about 6 or 7 years ago when the translation for the Novus Ordo Mass was updated by Pope Benedict, and we all had to get new missals, and I got this. I'll put a link in the description to this and all the other stuff I'm going to talk about in this video, so in case you want to get some of this stuff. But when this came in the mail, I was pleasantly surprised to see that all of the prayers for the whole Mass were in English on one side of the page, and they were in Latin on the other side of the page. And I thought, well, now I can go check out the Latin Mass, because at that time the Latin Mass was getting to be a thing again, and there was a parish downtown that was starting to have Latin Mass more regularly. So one of the following Sundays, I went downtown to this parish I've spoken about a number of times to attend the traditional Latin Mass. And I was pretty excited because I had the Latin. And when I got there and the Mass started, what I was expecting to see during the Mass, like what I normally see at any Sunday Mass, isn't exactly what I saw. There was different things happening, and this wasn't really helping me. I was completely confused. I was completely lost. And it was a very frustrating experience. Now, I could see while I was at that Mass that it was very beautiful. It was very solemn. There was something very significant happening, but I was pretty lost. And I left pretty frustrated. And even though I could tell that there was something very beautiful happening at the Latin Mass, I just kind of figured that it wasn't for me. Now, one day, maybe 9 months ago, I was moving books around and, changing my library here, and I came across this old book that, was just buried under a bunch of books, and I recognized it immediately. Back in 1988 or 89, whenever I graduated from 8th grade, I went to a Catholic school. I've talked about that in past videos. Back in 1988 or 89, one of the teachers at my Catholic school gave me this missal as a graduation gift. Her name was Mrs. Bennett. She was a wonderful teacher, and she wasn't Catholic, and I guess this was in her family, and it was a family heirloom, and she didn't really have anything to do with it because she wasn't Catholic anymore. So she decided to give it to me, and it's Latin. So in 1988, this was useless to me. I just put it on the bookshelf, and it's been sitting in a box all of these years. I didn't really know what to do with this. But now, finding this, I thought, well, let me look at this again. And I put it next to this, and I kind of started to go through these things side by side. And that's when I think I realized what my confusion had been way back when I tried to use this missal at the Latin Mass. Before I go on, let me just clarify, I'm not an expert on the Latin Mass. I've only been going for about 6 months, and what I want to share in this video is not necessarily facts about the Latin Mass, but just kind of my reflections after going for the last 6 months or so, because I have really fallen in love with the Latin Mass, and it's kind of like it reminds me of when you're a teenager and you fall in love for the first time and you kind of want to tell everybody about this great thing that's happening in your life. That's kind of what I'm going through right now with the Latin Mass. And as I've shared this love, this beauty that I've found with people, there's been a few Catholics who've had a very immediate response, a very kind of shocked response, a shock that I would prefer to go to Mass in a language that I don't speak. They say things like, I want to understand what is happening at the Mass, and I don't understand Latin. I don't speak Latin. And I think therein lies the confusion that I had at the very beginning of this video when I was referring to this missal at a Latin Mass and it wasn't quite working, because I think our generation, we were told by the older generation, those older than us, that the Mass had been in Latin and Vatican II translated it to the vernacular. And so there was this idea that we had that the Mass, nothing changed. It was in Latin and now it's in English. But when I put these two things right next to each other, that's not what I saw. What I saw was things that were very similar. They were kind of alike, but there's some significant differences. And this is definitely not an English translation of this. There seems to be a whole lot more than just saying Vatican II translated this into this. And I think in these conversations, as I've tried to share this beauty, this love that I found, these conversations, or some of them anyways, haven't gone very well because they end up getting bogged down in a discussion of language, of English versus Latin. What language should the Mass be in, instead of the beauty of the Mass? That the Mass should be very beautiful because it is true that we are all sinners and that we are all guilty and that we all deserve to be eternally punished. But Christ came, and he came to give us his life. He came to sacrifice his life to give us hope, to give us his flesh and blood to redeem us. And when the priest walks up to that altar, mystically, we are present at Calvary watching Christ walk up that hill to wash us in blood and in water. And for the last 20 years or so, we've been reading these Scott Hahn books. We've been listening to his talks as he explained this reality to us. And after 20 or so years, something in us has to change. We have to respond to this. We have to respond to what we are about to witness on that altar. Now, I don't mean to be overly vitriolic or nasty or to try in any way to politicize my reflections here, but every single Mass that I've ever attended in my entire life, the choir, as the priest is approaching the altar, the choir, the hymns that the choir is singing as the priest is approaching the altar, it's never corresponded or reflected in any way the theology that we've been learning for the last 20 years from these books. There's no correspondence at all. It's as if they're singing about something else. But at the Latin Mass, as the priest is approaching the altar, the choir, in the most somber and solemn tone you've ever heard in your life, chants in Latin, "Thou shalt sprinkle me with hyssop, O Lord, and I shall be cleansed. Thou shalt wash me, and I shall be made whiter than snow." Now this corresponds to the theology that we've learned. It corresponds to what we've read in Scripture, in the prophets, in Ezekiel. This makes sense with our faith. So I found something that's so amazing, so good, so beautiful. It reminds me of when I first met my wife, Rebecca. She was so amazing. I just couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't wait to see her again. She was just everything to me. And this beauty of this Mass, to kind of miss that whole thing of falling in love, this amazement, this beauty, because you don't speak Latin and you put that up as a wall and a barrier. Beauty has no language. The sacrifice of Christ, the love he poured out from the cross, it has no language. And as I've shared these thoughts with people, one of the common objections that I keep getting over and over again, like it must be some kind of talking point, is, Brad, missionaries used to say Mass in the middle of the jungle. And yes, that's true, but that was based on the circumstances. That should be an exception, not the norm. When we celebrate Mass, we should be making an offering of first fruits. That means our best. We should be offering the best that we have under those circumstances. And we are not in the middle of the jungle. We certainly have the ability to make a greater offering of who we are, where we are now. And using missionaries as an excuse for mediocrity, whether that's mediocrity in our music or the art that we have in our church or the architecture of the church or maybe the method of preaching that we use at Mass, using the missionaries as an excuse for mediocrity, it's kind of awful, because those missionaries were literally making a real offering of their very lives, because after saying Mass, many of them were in fact martyred. They were truly making an offering, the best offering that they could give of everything they had to give. Now, I'm not a church historian, and I'm not pretending to be. I'm sure somebody could contradict everything I'm about to say, but it seems to me, when looking throughout our history, that up until recently, there seems to always have been an effort by Catholics to give the best that we could give under the certain circumstances. So during the Middle Ages in Rome, at the Vatican, the best that they could get was Michelangelo, and so they got him to paint the Sistine Chapel. And in Florence, they devoted 800 years to building the Duomo, the cathedral in the center of town. And I know those are two very extreme examples, but even my family's little poor village down in Sicily, I think it's about 1,000-year-old village, and population of around 500 today, 250 people. I don't think anyone's under the age of 50. But this village is just a little farming village. They've grown grapes, tomatoes. That's what they do. No one there has any money. They have no resources. It's a peasant village. But 500 years ago, they built a parish church that to this day could be the most beautiful church in any city in North America. Now, 500 years ago, they were very poor. It was a peasant village. They had every excuse to just build a little simple, temporary, round building with, cheap furniture in it. But they made the decision to build something that was the best that they could possibly build, and to give the best that they could possibly offer to God. Now, about 20 years ago, on Christmas Eve, I was at a family member's house. They were having a party, and on the TV was the Midnight Mass in Rome. It was John Paul II. And as the Holy Father was walking into St. Peter's Basilica, one of the family members, a very liberal Catholic, announced, "We don't need all of that pomp and circumstance." And when I heard that, I kind of took over. I was like, "You're right. We don't need that. And neither does the God we're worshiping. But he deserves it. And by justice, we owe it to him to give him our best. We don't need clean air either. People live in polluted cities and they survive just fine. We don't need clean water. People drink polluted water and they survive just fine. We can survive off of Big Macs and chicken nuggets and donuts. We can survive just fine. But this isn't about surviving. This is about thriving. Christ came that we might have life and we might have it abundantly. If our mentality is, what is the least amount, the smallest amount that I can offer to God and still survive, then is there any wonder why belief in the Holy Eucharist has completely fallen? So I think before we can actually have the conversation about the Latin Mass, I think we really need to kind of understand the theology of what is actually happening at the Mass. So I highly recommend Scott Hahn's book, The Lamb's Supper. I have a link to this and these other books down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon, and thank you for watching. I've been going to the traditional Latin Mass almost exclusively, and everything was going just fine. It was just my little secret and no one knew. My wife didn't even know, although I think she was starting to get a little suspicious. But I had a really good thing going. I never thought I would get caught